Introduction. How Cowboys Survived the Brutal Winters of the 1880s, -30 degrees Fahrenheit. Tonight on Historia Prime, we're not riding into the warm, cinematic Wild West you've seen 1,000 times. We're stepping onto the open range in the dead of winter, a place where reality shatters the myth in seconds. Out here, your coffee freezes before you can drink it. Your boots turn to ice. Your moustache hardens into a frozen hedge. Picture yourself on horseback in a vast white sea stretching across Montana and Wyoming. It's 1886. Back at the ranch, the thermometer read -30 degrees Fahrenheit, but with the wind screaming across the plains, it feels closer to -60. In moments you understand the truth. You're not a movie hero. You're a fragile, heat-leaking organism fighting a losing war against physics. Dress like a Hollywood cowboy, and you'd be dead before the hour is out.
So how did they do it?
How did ordinary men, without Gore-Tex, without central heating, without anything except wool, leather and grit, survive a cold that would drop most of us in minutes? Tonight, we'll break down the gear, the food, the shelter, and the mental toughness that carried them through the legendary Big Die-Up. And along the way, we'll uncover lessons in resilience that still matter today. Settle in, pull a warm blanket around your shoulders, and let's ride straight into the storm. Part 1. The Gear. Dressing for the Deep Freeze. Staying warm wasn't optional on the open range. It was the first battle a cowboy fought every single morning. And the clothing Hollywood loves to romanticize would have killed a man long before sundown. In the 1880s, the rules were simple. Cotton was death, wool was life. Cotton soaked up sweat and snow, then drained heat from your body like a sponge. So every cowboy began with itchy, red flannel long johns, full-length wool that trapped a thin layer of warm air right against the skin. From there, warmth was built in layers. 2 or 3 wool shirts, then a heavy vest to shield the heart and lungs without trapping the arms. Mobility mattered just as much as insulation. But the real secret was on the legs. Denim froze solid in deep winter, so cowboys wore woolies, thick, shaggy chaps made from Angora goat hair or even bear hide. They looked wild, but they blocked wind, shed snow, and locked in heat so well your legs could burn inside them even at -30 degrees Fahrenheit. Circulation was everything, especially in the feet. Tight boots meant frostbite, so winter boots were bought 2 sizes too big. That extra space held thick wool socks, or for cowboys with empty pockets, hay or old newspaper packed inside the boot for insulation. Crude, yes, but surprisingly effective against frozen stirrups. And then came the one item no cowboy wanted to ride without, the buffalo hide coat. Heavy as a small child, nearly ankle length, and thick enough to stop the wind in its tracks, it functioned like a portable shelter. Turn the collar up, and it formed a warm tunnel around your face, letting you breathe without freezing. For the hands, survival demanded mittens, not gloves. Fingers separated from each other froze fast. So cowboys used huge leather mittens lined with wool or fur, and they learned to do nearly everything without ever taking them off. Finally, the bandana, what movies treat as decoration, was actually one of the most important tools a cowboy owned. Called a wild rag, often made of pure silk, it sealed the neck, shielded the jugular, and in storms was pulled over the nose and mouth to warm the air before it reached the lungs. Light, soft, and deceptively warm, silk often made the difference between frostbite and survival. Out here, clothing wasn't style, it was engineering, primitive, heavy, and absolutely essential. The right layers kept you alive. The wrong choice became a fatal mistake. Part 2. The Fuel. Calories versus cold. Now that the cowboy is dressed for the deep freeze, he faces the next battle, fueling the machine. In temperatures that can kill exposed skin in minutes, the human body becomes a furnace burning through nearly 6,000 calories a day just to stay alive. Out here, you don't eat for pleasure, you eat to keep the fire burning inside your ribs. The winter diet of an 1880s cowboy would horrify any modern doctor, yet it was perfectly engineered for survival. Nearly every meal was built on beef, beans, and pure animal fat. In the cold, fat wasn't a guilty indulgence, it was medicine, it was fuel. Cowboys didn't trim fat off their steaks, they hunted for it. They dipped biscuits into hot tallow or sucked marrow straight from split bones, because fat carries more energy than any carbohydrate ever could. And through all of it, there was one constant companion: coffee. Cowboy coffee wasn't a drink, it was a life support system. It lived on the stove day and night, black as tar and strong enough to jolt warmth into fingers that were losing sensation. There were no filters and there were no delicate brewing rituals. You smashed arbuckle beans with whatever object was closest: pistol butt, boot heel, a rock, and threw them into boiling water. The old saying goes, drop in a horseshoe, if it sinks, it's not ready yet. Exaggeration or not, the point stands. This wasn't cafe coffee. This was survival in a tin cup. For food on the trail, the staples were beans and sourdough biscuits. Cookie, the camp cook, guarded his sourdough starter the way a mother guards a child. Yeast is alive, and in winter it dies fast. Many cooks actually slept with the crock of starter tucked into their bedroll to keep it warm enough to survive another night in the cold. Then there was salt pork, the unglamorous workhorse of frontier calories. This wasn't bacon. This was pork so heavily salted it could survive a year underground. You soaked it to make it edible, fried it until it surrendered its grease, and that grease became liquid gold poured over beans, biscuits, anything that needed warmth and energy. And if fortune smiled on you, if the ranch had stocked well before winter, you might open a can of peaches. Sweet, soft, golden fruit in the dead of January. It wasn't just food, it was morale, a reminder that summer wasn't just a dream. In truth, the cowboy winter diet was simple: brown, salty, fatty food eaten without complaint. Because every calorie was a shield against the cold. Every bite meant one more hour in the saddle, one more night in the storm, one more chance to see spring again. Out here, survival tasted like tallow, beans, and bitter coffee. And you were grateful for every mouthful because it meant you lived another day. Part 3. The Shelter. Line camps and bedrolls. When the sun vanished and the cold began its nightly assault, survival came down to one question: where could a cowboy sleep without freezing to death? In winter, cattle drifted for miles, pushed by storms and instinct. To follow them, cowboys lived not at the ranch, but in isolated outposts called line camps, tiny, rough cabins perched between civilization and the edge of the range. Most of these shacks were hardly more than timber boxes dug into the slope of a hill, using the earth itself as insulation. Sod and dirt formed the roof, and wind rattled the walls like they wanted in. Inside, you and one partner shared a space no bigger than a modern bathroom. A cast-iron stove glowed red in the corner, working overtime to hold back the cold, pressing from every direction. The room filled with the mingled scents of sweat, smoke, wet wool, and boiling coffee, an aroma that, to a cowboy, meant safety. Every gap in the walls was stuffed with mud, cloth, or anything that stopped the drafts. In a blizzard, that shack became a sealed pressure capsule, fighting a war against the wind. And when firewood ran low, you burned cow chips, dried manure. It crackled, smelled sharp, but burned hot and steady, provided you could scrape it out from under the snow. Yet sometimes even the shack was too far away. Storms on the plains didn't wait. They struck fast, swallowing the horizon in minutes. When that happened, your only protection was the tool every cowboy respected as much as his horse: the bedroll. A bedroll wasn't a simple blanket. It was a survival system, layers of quilts wrapped inside waterproof canvas, forming a cocoon against the cold. You never removed your boots. If you did, they'd freeze solid, or your swollen feet would never fit inside again. You loosened the laces, changed into dry socks if you had them, and slid into the shugan, trusting fabric and habit to keep you alive until dawn. On nights when the temperature fell past the thermometer's scale, cowboys used whatever tricks they had left. Heated stones wrapped in cloth were tucked near the feet, radiating precious warmth through the night. And in the most desperate moments, when visibility vanished and snow buried the world, you might press your body against a cow or horse, using its massive bulk as a living furnace. It was messy, it was smelly, and it worked. Because out there, warmth didn't have to be clean, it just had to be enough to wake up alive. Part 4. The Mental Game. Isolation and Cabin Fever. Surviving the winter wasn't only about beating the cold, it was about beating your own mind. Because once the storms rolled in and the snow climbed halfway up the door, you weren't living on the open range anymore. You were living inside a 10 by 10 wooden box with one other human being. For months. Outside, the wind never stopped screaming. Inside, the silence pressed against you just as hard. And in that tight, air-stale room, the smallest habits became detonators. A partner chewing too loudly, a snore in the middle of the night, the way someone shuffled cards or stirred their coffee. In a space that tiny, those little irritations didn't stay little. They grew teeth. They pushed men right up to the edge of violence. This was the invisible enemy of the plains, cabin fever, a mental unraveling as dangerous as frostbite, capable of undoing tough men who had already endured gunfights, cattle stampedes, and storms. To hold their minds together, cowboys had to fill the void. They carved scraps of wood into makeshift tools or toys. They played endless rounds of solitaire with decks so greasy and worn the numbers nearly disappeared. They read the same labels on tin cans until they had them memorized. Anything to keep the brain moving. And when silence grew too heavy, they fought it back with sound. Music wasn't entertainment, it was survival. A fiddle, a harmonica, even a simple jaw harp could push back the loneliness. Cowboys sang not just for the cattle, but for their own sanity, letting the songs echo inside the tiny walls like a lifeline. And then there were the stories. The infamous tall tales, dry, dark, exaggerated humor that turned misery into something you could laugh at. You'd hear legends of winters so cold that words froze in the air before they reached your ears, and you had to wait for spring just to finish a conversation. Absurd, yes, but in that absurdity was a shield. Humor became armor, one of the few defenses a cowboy had against the creeping dread of isolation. Because in the end, winter wasn't just testing the body, it was testing the mind. And the cowboys who survived weren't just strong, they were resilient enough to stay human in a world built to break them. Part 5. The Work. No days off. So far, we've talked about the clothing that kept a cowboy alive and the food that kept his inner fire burning. But winter on the range wasn't a season of hiding indoors. It was a season of relentless work. Because when the temperature dropped, the jobs didn't stop. They multiplied. Cattle could endure the cold, but they couldn't endure dehydration. Water was life, and in the winter, water was locked under 2 feet of ice. So every morning, long before dawn, you rode out with an axe or a pick and spent hours hacking through frozen ponds. The work was brutal. Your shoulders screamed, and every swing sent ice shards flying into the air. And there was a cruel paradox hidden inside this chore. The moment you began sweating, your survival clock started ticking. Sweat soaked into your layers, and once you stopped moving, that moisture froze against your skin. If you didn't manage your pace, your own effort could kill you on the ride home. But the job didn't end with water. When blizzards swept across the plains, the cattle drifted, turning their backs to the wind and walking for miles. They only stopped when something stopped them, usually a fence. And when hundreds of animals pressed forward into a barrier, the ones in front were crushed, buried in snow, or frozen upright. Your task in those storms was to cut the drift fences or lead the herd toward a canyon or gulch where the land itself could offer shelter. It was dangerous, freezing, disorienting work, and you often did it with visibility reduced to almost nothing. Because in a whiteout, the horizon simply vanished. The world became a uniform sheet of grey, where sky and earth blended into one. You could lose your bearings 10 steps from the shack. Cowboys learned to tie ropes from the cabin door to the barn so they could feel their way home through blindness, trusting the line the way a sailor trusts a lifeline on a stormy deck. Through all of this, one truth defined the winter cowboy's life. There were no days off. Storm or no storm, daylight or darkness, warmth or bone-deep cold, the cattle depended on you. And if you didn't show up, if you missed even one task, something died. Winter wasn't just a season, it was a test of endurance, discipline, and duty, written across an endless landscape of ice. Part 6. Frontier Medicine. Whiskey and Grit. Out on the winter range, getting sick wasn't an inconvenience. It was a threat every bit as deadly as the cold itself. There were no antibiotics waiting in a cabinet, no urgent care down the road, and the nearest doctor, if he existed at all, was often a 3-day ride away, trudging through the same storms you were. Even then, you weren't guaranteed a sober one. So cowboys relied on the only pharmacy they had: whiskey. In the 1880s West, whiskey treated everything. Got a cough? Take a swig. Frostbite? Rub it on. Toothache? Numb yourself and yank. It wasn't science, it was desperation wrapped in a burn. People believed whiskey drove the chill out, even though we now know alcohol actually makes you lose heat faster. But when the temperature dropped to murderous levels, even a false warmth felt like hope. For the deeper sicknesses, chest colds, pneumonia, what they bleakly called winter lung, the remedies became even more extreme. Cowboys mixed whiskey with molasses and onions to make thick syrups they swallowed by the spoonful. Some went further, stirring kerosene with sugar into a mixture that, by modern standards, sounds like poison. Yet when your lungs felt like they were filling with ice water and the nearest help was 50 miles through snowdrifts, you didn't care about poison. You cared about breathing long enough to see morning. But the most constant threat was frostbite, the silent thief. It crept into noses, ears, fingers, toes, numbing them before a man even understood he was in danger. Cowboys learned to read each other's faces, scanning for the pale white patches that meant skin was freezing. And when it happened, you didn't rub snow on it, no matter what the old folk tales claimed. That only tore the tissue. You warmed the frozen skin gently, against your stomach, your armpit, wherever living heat could reach it without burning. It wasn't elegant medicine, it wasn't always safe, but on the frontier, survival rarely waited for perfection. It waited for grit, quick thinking, and the willingness to do whatever it took to keep a man alive until sunrise. In a world defined by cold and distance, whiskey wasn't just a drink. It was courage, it was comfort, and sometimes it was the only line of defense a cowboy had left. Part 7. The Climax. The Big Die-Up. 1886 to 1887. Everything we've explored so far, the gear, the discipline, the food, the shelter, was leading toward one moment in history. A moment that broke the back of the Old West and ended the age of the open range. It was the winter of 1886 to 1887, remembered forever as the Big Die-Up. The warning signs began months earlier. The summer of 1886 was brutally hot and bone dry. Grass was scarce, water was thin, Yet ranchers and wealthy investors continued to pour cattle onto the plains, millions more than the land could support. Money from the East and Britain fueled a frenzy called the beef bonanza, and no one believed the West could fail them. Then the winter came, early, hard, and it did not stop. Blizzard after blizzard smashed into the Great Plains, burying the world under mountains of snow. The cattle, already weakened from the drought, couldn't reach the grass beneath the frozen crust. Temperatures plunged to -40, -50, even -60 degrees, with wind chills beyond anything modern instruments can describe. And the dying began. Cattle stacked against the drift fences in suffocating piles, freezing into grotesque sculptures overnight. Cowboys returned from morning patrols with stories of animals wandering blindly through the white abyss, their eyes turned to glass by the cold. Wolves and coyotes, bold with hunger, prowled the edges of line camps, tearing into the herds as if the world had become one long battlefield. Through it all, cowboys fought like soldiers in a hopeless war. They rode into storms that felt alive, pushing through winds that ripped the breath from their lungs. They tried to break trails for starving cattle, tried to drag hay across frozen ground, tried anything, absolutely anything, to slow the collapse. But nature was not bargaining. Nature was erasing. When the spring thaw finally arrived in 1887, the West woke to a silence more terrifying than the storms. Rivers choked with carcasses, fields littered with bones, millions of animals gone, entire fortunes wiped out. Some ranchers lost 90% of their herds in a single season. And just like that, the era of the roaming cowboy, the cowboy king riding free across endless open land, was over. The open range was finished. Barbed wire, controlled grazing, and modern ranching rose from its ashes. The big die-up delivered a message carved deeply into the history of the American West. No amount of toughness, leather, wool, or grit can save you when the weather decides to show you who truly rules the plains. It was a lesson in humility written in ice, and the cowboys who survived never forgot it. Conclusion: lessons from the ice. So what, in the end, do these frozen riders of the 1880s teach us? They remind us that comfort is a luxury, not a guarantee. They show us that when the world turns harsh, survival belongs to those who prepare, who adapt, and who respect the forces bigger than themselves. The winter cowboy didn't waste breath complaining about the cold. He studied it, he dressed for it, he ate for it, and most importantly, he never faced it alone. Because the cowboy of winter was not the gun-slinging outlaw of Hollywood myth. He was a caretaker of land, of animals, of his fellow riders. He was the man who would sleep against a shivering cow to save its life, who would swing an axe through feet of ice so his herd could drink, who would sing into the darkness just to keep his own spirit from freezing. And maybe that is the lesson that still matters today. The next time you're waiting for your car to warm up or pulling your coat a little tighter on a cold walk to the mailbox, think of the line shack buried in snow. Think of the buffalo hide coat. Think of the men who faced -30 degrees, not as a temporary inconvenience, but as a daily reality, and survived because they understood that resilience is a skill, not a gift. If this journey through the deep freeze gave you something to think about, tap that like button. It warms up the algorithm more than you'd expect. And subscribe to Historia Prime for more stories of endurance, survival, and the quiet brilliance of people who refuse to quit. Now I have one question for you. Would you have survived the winter of 1886? Or would you have taken the first train back east? I'm your host here at Historia Prime, and I'll see you next time. Stay warm out there.